Okay, so in this section, we're going to talk about selecting a stave. And I've got a bunch of staves behind me here. Most of them are Osage. I've got a couple of U staves and an oceanspray here. But what we're going to talk about, it doesn't matter what kind of wood it is. We're going to talk about characteristics that are universal to all bow staves. And I'm going to take a look at these things and I'm going to tell you what I'm looking for, what I'm seeing, what I'm thinking about when I'm looking at this particular stave. And so let's just go ahead and jump right into it. So this stave to start with, this is an Osage Orange stave. It's fairly short. Obviously not going to be able to get a long bow out of it. Now, the one big thing that I'm looking at when I look at this stave is you can see that this stave has a natural deflex in it. So it's bending away from the back. Now, this is actually not a bad stave. Ideally, I want to go, if I have my choice, my top of the line staves are going to have reflex in them or back set. So basically, for this stave, instead of bending this way, it's going to bend this way. That back set is highly desirable in a bow stave. Another thing that you'll notice about this stave is that it has a little bit of a curve this way to it. Now, the way I build bows, that's not a problem because we're going to lay it out along that natural grain, and then we're going to bend everything with heat and line everything up. So that C curve is not a problem. And if this, sometimes you'll run into staves that has almost like an S curve into it. So one side of it will go this way, and it'll come up, and the other side will go this way. Again, that's not a problem if you build bows by laying it out on the natural grain and then heating everything up and bending it into alignment. Okay, so next stave, again an Osage Orange stave. So there again, you can see that this stave has kind of a C curve to it. We'll be able to fix that. This is actually a pretty nice stave. It's got just a little bit of back set. And other than that C curve, it's a really nice stave. The only thing that can make this stave better is if it was straight, and then we wouldn't have to worry about heating anything up and bending it into alignment. So again, Osage Orange. This one has had the bark removed down to the sapwood. And this one has actually a pretty good bit of back set. The big thing that I'm seeing when I look at this stave though is it's got quite a bit of propeller twist. So if you'll notice, this end of the stave is kind of pointed off that direction, and that end is pointed off this direction. Now, that is not necessarily a problem. When I look at this stave, I can make a bow out of this stave with propeller twist in the bow, and that's not going to hurt anything at all. I've made lots of bows with one limb pointed one way and the other pointed the other way. It's not a problem for a straight limbed bow. You're going to be limited in the type of bow that you can get with this stave. You're probably not going to want to build a recurve out of this, because if you try to recurve these limb tips, it's going to be real hard to get your limb tips to line up when the bow is braced, unless you do some pretty heavy duty heating and try to take this propeller twist out of this stave. Another thing that immediately jumps out to me about this stave, and what I'm about to talk about is kind of particular to Osage, but you'll notice that when this stave was split, the split is very clean. There's not a lot of grain that's running off like this one. I'll come back to that in a minute. But this stave has a bunch of the grain is kind of torn and stuff. It's not bad, but there's a little bit. And what that is telling me is that the grain on this stave here the cleaner it splits, the less snaky character you're going to find in that stave, and you're going to end up with cleaner lines. It's going to be easier to make a bow out of a stave that splits clean than one that splits and has a bunch of torn grain in it. So here is a pretty nice stave. It's fairly narrow from the belly to the back, and so that's something that you need to look for. I think I still got plenty of room in as far as the depth of this stave goes, but if you wanted to make a real deep handled bow, you might run into you might have to include some of this wood that's already kind of torn up in your handle. You're not going to be able to get down to real clean wood with this if you want to make a real deep handled bow. It's got a little bit of back set. One thing you will notice about this stave is there are some knots in it. There's actually quite a few knots in it. And so this one split pretty cleanly, but when I take the bark and the sapwood off of here, I'm gonna have some snake in the back due primarily just to the knots, and I'm gonna have to really think hard about how to lay this bow out so that I don't have these knots on the edge of the stave. But we can make, I think this stave will make a nice bow. All right, so this stave here is a stave of Pacific Yew. And one thing you'll notice is that one side is split and the other side is sawn with a bandsaw or something like that. There are a few knots in the back of this bow. Here's a big one, a big knot right here. And so that's going to be, it's not right in the middle part of the working part of the limb, but it is going to be in the working part of the limb. So we're going to have to take that into account. Normally, I don't want a stave that's been sawn normally, because what happens when you saw a stave is you tend to cut across the grain. This one is not bad because it's split on one side, which tells me that the grain is running straight up and down. Now, if it's sawn on both sides, sometimes that can be okay. Sometimes you might run into a little bit of trouble, especially if that tree had some twist in it and then you saw a stave out of it. Basically, you're cutting across that grain, and that's not the ideal situation. Again, a fairly straight stave, very little back set, or no back set at all, actually. So here we have a Hawthorne stave, and this is a pretty small diameter stave, and so another thing you'll notice is all these little thorns that are coming off of it. All of these things are going to be little pin knots in the back of this bow. So with it being so small diameter, I mean, we're talking, 2.5 inches or so down here at the small end. We're either going to have to make this a fairly narrow bow, or we can decrown it to try to flatten that back out a little bit. You want to try to avoid a real high crown on a bow, because the center part of that crown is going to be the farthest. When you bend that bow, the center part of that crown is the farthest away from the neutral plane in the running down the center of that limb from front to back. And so the farther out you push that crown, that just concentrates all that stress right along that spine and increases the chances of the bow coming apart on the back at that crown. These can make, I've seen bows made out of Hawthorne staves like this with all these little pin knots on them. They make some pretty cool looking bows. They're real lumpy looking, where you have to leave all these little pin knots on there. You of course take the thorns off, but you're going to be left with a bunch of little knots on the back of the bow. So when I'm looking at this stave, you'll see that if I lay my bow out with it on top here, I'm gonna have some back set, and that's what I'm gonna do. That's what I'm gonna be looking for. I don't wanna try to lay the bow out, you know, with the laying on top of it like this or like this, because I'm gonna have some deflects like this. So I'm gonna look at this stave, find where my back set is, and I'm gonna lay this bow out right on top of this stave to take advantage of that back set. So this stave here, again, just a little bit of propeller twist, not bad. This end of the stave here has a little bit of deflex in it, which isn't ideal. I would rather have it straight or a little bit of reflex, but we can get a good bow out of this. We're probably gonna end up having to put some heat on this end and put a little bit of reflex into it so that it'll match this end down here. But other than that, it's a pretty nice stave. So here again is a Pacific U stave. Now, one thing, at least in North Idaho, that's pretty common with U is you'll see the trees are oftentimes damaged, and you'll have where the bark has been stripped off. Pacific yew is actually a very important winter browse for moose, and the moose will winter up in those yew stands, and the yew bark and the yew foliage is what they eat. And so oftentimes you'll find the bark stripped off of these trees, and you can actually see the teeth marks from a moose right here in this tree. Now, if this whole tree was damaged like this, it wouldn't be worth cutting, but if you flip this stave around and look at this side, we've got one side of the stave is really nice and clean, and there's there's just a few small knots in it, but other than that, it's a really nice stave, really straight. It is fairly small diameter, and so probably I'm not gonna end up making a wide flat bow out of this. Probably gonna make a narrow English style longbow or something like that. Okay, so here we have a piece of ocean spray, and this one is super small diameter. I'm gonna probably end up decrowning this stave. I'll just take the draw knife and just flatten one side of it out. And when I lay this bow out, I'm gonna lay it out just like this to take advantage of that reflex in that end. And then you'll notice this end actually has a little bit of deflex, and so probably what we're gonna end up doing is once I get it decrowned and get the limb thinned out a little bit, I'm gonna end up taking some heat and heating this limb tip into a reflex to match this one. I'll actually put a little bit more reflex in this side than this side because a little bit of it's going to pull out when I start going to tiller the bow. So this stave again is it's a pretty nice stave. This one does have, this is the one that I showed you that had the grain that was kind of torn out a little bit right in here. It's gonna be probably have a little bit more character. I've got a place right here where there was a limb coming out, and so I've got a dip in the grain right there. This end looks like there may have been another tree kind of growing real close to it right here, and they kind of grew around each other. And so just be aware that this bow is gonna have kind of a whoop-de-doo up on this limb tip. And probably what you're gonna find when you go to dig in to this stuff right here, you're gonna find that the annual growth rings down here are gonna probably be compressed and not the same thickness as they are down here in the main part of the stave. Okay, so we've got a big old stave here. Right off the bat, the thing that jumps out to me about this stave is it has got bug damage in it. These holes here are about a quarter inch long, oval shaped, and this is probably damage from a horntail wasp. These staves were cut and stored in the South, in Alabama, Florida, and horntail wasps will lay an egg, and the larvae gets in here, and sometimes they only go through the sapwood, but I know I've had other staves that came from this place that had the same damage, and these wasps are going down into this stave about an inch. So I'll know that when I take the bark and the sapwood off, I'm still going to have to go down probably another ½ inch into the heartwood to get below all that bug damage. So just watch out for that. This stave it's a big stave, so there's plenty of room here. I can get down below all that bug damage and still have plenty of wood to make a bow with this particular stave. Other than that, there's just a little bit of propeller twist, but not bad at all. It's a pretty nice stave. So with Osage in particular, one of the things that you're going to hear talked about a lot is the thickness of the growth rings. Now, me personally, I like a stave that has tight growth rings. It seems to me that so tight growth rings indicate that tree was growing under stress, and oftentimes what I've found anyway is that the stressed trees oftentimes are the ones that'll make the best bows. The only time that a thick growth ring is going to help you is they tend to be easier for a beginner to follow a single ring. You're not nearly as apt to break through those thick rings as you are with a tight ringed stave.